Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to a new video. So today I'm showing us how to draft a Victorian corset. If this is something you are interested in, you have to stick to the channel. You have to watch the video to the end, and of course you have to subscribe. Please give me a like, that way I get recommended by YouTube and then I get a lot of views. So support this channel by liking and sharing, and also leaving a comment. So if this is something you're interested in, how to make a Victorian corset is something you're interested in, watch the video to the end and I'm sure that you're going to be learning one or two things. If you're also a beginner, thank you also for stopping by this channel. I appreciate all of you. Now for a Victorian corset, you'll be needing your basic bodice pattern from the nape of your shoulder down to your hip line. So if you've not seen a video on how I drafted that, I will also be leaving the link in the description box. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will see you guys in the next one, which is coming up right after this one. Stay blessed. Bye. So here I have my pattern. I have indicated my horizontal and vertical lines on this pattern, and right here I have the length of 23 inch for the length of this top. So right here on my pattern, on the first line I have there, which is a vertical line that is serving as the center front line. Okay, this is the center front line, and that is where I'll be taking all of my measurements. I have my shoulder line. I've done the shoulder drop. I have the armhole line, the chest line, the bust line, the under bust line, the waistline, and also my hip line. And I said the length of my top is 23 inch. Can decide to extend it if you want your top to be longer than this. So in making a Victorian corset, you want it to just sit nicely on your body. Now the next thing I'll be doing is to go up by 2.5 inch. I'll be increasing the neckline of this pattern, and the reason why I'm doing that is so that I have enough coverage on my boobs. You can either do your bust radius, which is the distance from your bust line to your under bust line, and then you represent it upward. That will automatically cover your boobs entirely. But if you don't want that, if you want to leave some form of cleavage on your boobs, you can either use your chest line or you can come 1 inch below your chest line. So now this new line that I've marked, this new horizontal line that I've marked, is my new neckline for this pattern. Now I'm going to go ahead and mark out my armhole line. So on my chest line, I'm going to place quarter of my chest measurement. I'll place it right there, and then I'll use my ruler to connect it to touch my shoulder drop to create the armhole. Now if you're familiar with our video on how to draft a basic bodice pattern, this is just the same thing. There is no much difference. And also our video on how to draft the bustier as well, they are all the same. So right here that I've marked my armhole line, I'm going to now work on placing our dart. So for you to place your dart, you need your bust span, the distance from one nipple to the other, and in this situation I have 7.5 divided by 2, that is 3.75. so 3.75 is what I placed on my hip line, waistline, on the bust line, and also on my bust line. So this new vertical line that I've just drawn from my hip line to touch my bust line is the new line that is going to serve as the point where we are going to be opening up our dart. So moving up to the shoulder line, I'm going to get the midpoint of my shoulder, and then I'm going to reconnect them with a slanted line. So you can see from where my tape is, from where my ruler is to where the bust line is, the line there is kind of slanted. So this is how we're going to be connecting it to touch our shoulder line. All right, now that I have this line running on my pattern, on the new neckline that I have, I'm going to take a dart of 0.75 inch on both sides. And the reason why I'm doing that is so that the overbust tightening, that is the shoulder, the neckline is tightened and it doesn't fall off. All right, so that is why we are taking a dart on that point. Coming down to the waistline, I'm also going to take 0.75 inch on the waistline as well. Now I'm going to be reconnecting these dart legs back to touch the hip line and also to touch my apex, which is the bust line. I hope I'm not too fast for you guys. If you watched up to this point, please give me a like, subscribe to the channel. Okay, so now that I'm done creating my dart legs, my dart shape on my pattern, I'm going to also use my curve ruler to draw out the curve for the neckline. Okay, so at this point, this is where you would want all of the curves on your pattern to come into play. So I'm going to be using my curvy ruler to mark out the curve on my neck pattern, on my neck dart, so that the bustier can form nicely. All right, so I'll do this for one side of the dart, and I will also do this for this other side of the dart. So at this point you can see that we have some sort of bust curve happening towards that direction of the bust line and the neckline. So now that I've taken out this curve, I've taken out this dart on my neckline, the next thing that I will be doing is to place all of my measurements so that we can create the side seam, and then we can do the underbust tightening. But before we get to the underbust tightening, I'm going to create my side seam. So please take note of where all of my measurement is starting from. My measurement is starting from my center front line. So on my chest line, I have my quarter of my chest, my waist, sorry, quarter of my bust measurement. Then I added 1.5 inch to it for the darts that I took on the neckline. Okay, now coming down to the waistline, I placed my tape on the center front line, and I took quarter of my waist circumference, and then I added the 1.5 inch that I took on the waistline. I added it back at the side. Moving on to the hip line, my hip is 40 divided by 4, and that will be 10. So I placed that also on that point. Now what we're going to do is to connect these 3 points together so that we can create the side seam of the pattern. So now I'm going to be doing my underbust tightening after we've gotten the side seam. So you place your tape on your center front line at your underbust line, and you are going to be taking your circumference divided by 4, the underbust circumference divided by 4. So you place a mark at that point. Now from there you can see that I have some excess at the side there. Now that excess is approximately 1.5 inch, and that is what I'm going to be placing on my underbust. So for the center front line towards the dart leg, the outer dart leg, I'm going to take 0.5 inch. So the smaller figure, you're going to place it on your center front line, while the greater figure, which is 1 inch, I'm going to be placing it on the side front line. Okay, so you can see how I did it, and you're going to be taking the dart from the previous drafted for the previous dart legs that you placed on your pattern. I hope that is understood. So now that I have these lines on my underbust, I'm going to be connecting them all the way to touch my hip line. You can decide to go 1 inch up on your hip line if you want to, but I'm going to just leave mine like this. So I've connected the underbust tightening to touch my hip line, and you can see what we have right there on the underbust. So to complete this underbust tightening intake, we are going to now extend that leg to touch the apex, that's to touch the bust line. So for you to do that, I'm going to be using my curved ruler again, and then you can see the way I placed it on my pattern, and I went ahead to draw out the curve. So you can see this curve actually represents the shape of the bust. So just gradually connect the curve at the underbust to touch your bust line. So I'll repeat the same thing for the center front as well. I use my curve ruler, and then I'm going to connect from that underbust tightening to touch the bust line. Okay, so right here you can see what we have at the moment. Everything is looking gorgeous. So I'm just going to shade out the parts that we are not going to be needing anymore. So right, so this is the part where I'm shading out right now is the part where we are going to be cutting out when we cut out this pattern. So now, because this is a Victorian corset, you need your waist to be snatched and you want it to really hug your figure. So now, after taking out these darts, we will be needing to take out one more dart. And because my pattern has my full measurement of the waist, the hip and the bust line, so I'm going to be taking out one more dart on this pattern so that we have some sort of snatched waist on this corset. Now, to take the second dart from the point where I have my armhole line running on the top, I'm going to bring down that line to touch my hip line. You can see how I'm doing it like that. So I just brought down that line all the way down to touch my hip line. Now, moving down to the waistline, I'm going to take a dart of 1 inch. Okay, so I've reduced my waist, I've reduced 1 inch from my waist measurement so that I have some sort of snatched waist. So I'm going to take 1 inch on that part on the waistline. Then I reconnected it back to touch my hip line, and also I'm going to reconnect that back to touch my chest line. So now I've taken away 1 inch dart from the center of my pattern, that is from the front of my pattern. I hope you understand that. Now I'm going to be shading that out as well. So this 1 inch dot that I've taken is what we are going to be taking out from our pattern. So automatically on my waistline, for the front, I've taken out 1 inch, which would now make our waist to kind of have that snatch effect we need. Now we're going to be adding the last dart, which is the side dart. So I'll come down by 1 inch from my bust line, and I'm going to connect it to touch my bust line apex point, and this is for the side dart. I'm also going to shade that out as well because we need to be folding it in when we are about to cut this pattern. Alright, so after folding this in, next we are going to be working on the style line. Most Victorian corsets you see, mostly they come with the sweetheart neckline. So we are going to go with our sweetheart neckline. So what I will do right now is to take my curve. Okay, I'm going to take my ruler now, and I'm going to tilt it towards the center front line, just 1 inch above the apex line, that's the bust line, and I'm going to connect it back to touch the dark leg. I'll repeat the same thing for the other side of the dark leg as well. I'm going to connect it with the curve and ensure that the curve runs smoothly into the armhole. Okay, so you can see the way I'm doing it in the video. That is just how I want it to be. You can decide a different style line for yours if you want to. So I'm just going ahead to shade out the curve and ensuring that it runs directly under my armhole. Okay, now that the style line for this corset has been formed, next thing I'm going to do is to cut out. So, and I need to fold in my side dart. So for us to be able to fold in the side dart, you need to open up the waist dart to be able to close it, to be able to close the bust dart. Okay, so for this pattern, like I said, you can either add a yoke to it, or you can decide not to add a yoke to it. So whichever one you prefer, it is still workable. Right now I've slashed my waistline dart open, and you can see the moment I slashed it open, it enabled us to be able to fold in our side dart. Okay, so you can see now that we folded in the side dart, we have some kind of displacement of lines. I'm going to use my ruler now to reconnect those lines so that we have exactly the amount of fabric we need at that point when we transfer this pattern onto our fabric. So right here I've reconnected my side line again after folding in the bust dart. Okay, now you can now go ahead and cut out your pattern. You are only cutting out the shaded part of this pattern. Please note that this pattern does not have a sewing allowance to it. I'm going to be adding all of my sewing allowances later on. I'm going to show you that. So I'm just going ahead to cut out the shaded darts that I took on my pattern. So just pay attention, look at the way I'm cutting out my darts, and just go ahead and do that. So before I am done cutting out all of my pattern, before I forgot, on my side I went up by 2 inches. Now we need to create that back effect that is usually on the Victorian corset. So I went up by 2 inches, and then I used my ruler again to reconnect back to the hip line. So this is so that we have some sort of curve going on from the hip line, from the side of the hip down to the front of my panel. I hope you get that. So now after creating that 2 inch upward, I'm going to also go ahead and cut that as well. So just enjoy the way I am cutting out this pattern, and after I am done cutting, this is what the pattern looks like. This is what the front looks like. So at the end of the day, I have 3 panels for the front. I have the middle part, I have the center front, the middle part, and the side front. So it is important that you label all of those parts so that you won't get it confused. It won't confuse you when you're about to transfer this on your pattern. I also recommend that you add grain lines on your pattern so you know the direction in which you are going to be placing the pattern on your fabric when you are about to cut this on your fabric. So you can see I also went ahead to cut out the yoke as well. You have the option of either not adding the yoke to your pattern or adding the yoke. So whichever one you decide, the yoke can come in handy whenever you want to. Alright, so this is what the front looks like. Now we are going to move on to the back. So onto the back now, I have my vertical and horizontal measurements already on my pattern. The difference between the front and the back is 22 inch for the back, while the front has 23 inch. I have my neck width, my shoulder slope, my bust line, on my waistline, and my hip line represented on the pattern, and then I have the center back line running down on the pattern. So on my center back line, I'm going to go in by 1/2 inch. This is so that at that point at the back we have some form of structure going on there. And also at this point, when you go in by 1/2 inch on your waist, if you're going to be using a zipper, you can now reconstruct your zipper to take that shape you have on your waistline. So after creating that 1/2 inch on my waistline, I took out a dart and then redrew it back into the back pattern of this pattern. So I redrew it back to the back pattern. Now on the waistline, I went on to take my bust span divided by 2. I placed a mark on the waistline, the hip line, and also on the bust line. So this is so that we can create the dart for the back. Now that we have these 3 points, I'm going to use my ruler to draw a vertical line to connect these 3 points together, and from this line we will be opening up the dart for the back. Now after drawing out the vertical line for this point, for this pattern, at the waistline I'm going to go in by 0.75 inch on both sides. So I'll be taking away 1.5 inch for that for the waistline, and then I'm going to reconnect it back to touch the hip line, and also reconnect it back to touch our bust line. All right, so now I've created the first dart for this corset pattern. The next thing after creating the dart for this part, we are now going to mark out our side seam. So for us to mark out our side seam, I'm going to be replacing the 1.5 inch dart that I took on the waist, and also for the neckline of the back, for the style line of the back, I will be coming down by 1 inch from the bust line. Okay, 1 inch from the bust line. Then I'll use my ruler to connect to the chest line to create the style line for the back. All right, so you can see the way I am doing it. As you see me doing like that, I've just connected it to my chest line. Now this is the style line for the back. You can do a different kind of style line if you don't want this. Now coming down to the hip line, I will place 1/4 of my hip circumference on the hip line, and then I'll place a mark there. So at this point now, what we need to do is to use our ruler to create the side seam of the back panel. So I'm just going to use my ruler now, and I'm going to be connecting the 3 points, that is the hip, the waist, and the bust, the chest line of my pattern, so that we can create the side of our pattern. Okay, the side seam of the back pattern. Now that that has been formed, what I'll do next is to draw out the second dart for the back. Now this is a Victorian corset. Placing that everywhere is what gives it the structure that it needs. So like I did for the front, I'm going to come down from my armhole line down to meet the hip line, and at the waistline of that line I'm going to go in by 1/2 inch on both sides. So what this means is that I've taken away 1 inch from the back and also 1 inch for the front. So this way it will give our waist some more structure, it will reduce your waist size, and then it will give you that shape and that figure that you want to have whenever you wear a corset, a Victorian corset or any kind of corset. So I've taken away 1/2 inch on both sides, reconnected it down to touch the hip line and also to touch the waistline. Now I'm going to be shading out all this part. Now the part where I'm shading is the part that we are going to be cutting out on our pattern. I hope we get that. So from the center back line, I'm going to come in by 1.5 inch. At the top I went in by 1 inch, and at the hip line I went in by 1 inch. So at the center back I went in by 1/2 inch, at the bust line I went in by 1 inch, and at the hip line I went in by 1 inch. Now I'm going to be connecting these 3 points together. I'm taking off these inches that I've just marked so that we have an open back kind of corset. I hope you know what I mean. So after drawing out the shape, I discovered that I really want it to be a straight one. So I went ahead to still use my straight ruler to just mark out a straight line. But if you want yours to take the shape that I initially drew, you can go ahead and do that. It's not going to affect anything. So this new straight line that I have just drawn is where I am going to be placing my eyelet. So please note that the 1.5 inch I came in from my waistline is going to be cut off, so we have that opening at the back. Okay, so at that point where we have our eyelet, I came in by 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to be drawing out the style line for this pattern for the back. So right there I'm going to be connecting from that point to touch the neckline, to touch the shoulder line, sorry, of this pattern. That is if your pattern has a yoke on it. So I'm just going to be doing this just for those people who want their pattern to have a yoke on it. That is why I did that. Now coming down to the hip line, I went up by 2 inches like I did for the front, and then I reconnected it back to touch the hemline of the hip line, sorry. I reconnected it back to touch the hip line, so we have that back effect for our Victorian corset. Now that that is done, what I'll do next is to go ahead and cut out our pattern. All right, so I'm going to just go ahead and cut this out, and after cutting this out, please note that you are only going to be cutting out your darts, the 2 darts that you have, and also you're going to be cutting out the panel that you have on your center back. So just watch carefully the way I'm cutting this out so that you don't make mistakes. And like I said, for the front, please ensure that you label this part so that you won't get confused, because these things tend to look alike. So ensure that you label them and also add your green lines to them so you know which part goes with which when you transfer this onto your fabric. So you can see me now, I'm cutting out the center back as well. The part where I came in by 1.5 inch at the back, I've cut it out. Now I'm going to go ahead and label each of the parts like I said, so we don't get confused, and I'm going to be adding all of my grain lines on it as well. Now for the yoke, if you want to be adding a yoke to yours, like I said in the beginning for the front, you can go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to cut out this yoke, and if you're going to be attaching the kind of yoke that I've just drawn on this pattern, what you need to do after cutting it out is to hold the shoulder line by 1/2 inch. Okay, so on that shoulder line, you can see on that slanted part of the shoulder line, I'm going to take out 1/2 inch, and the reason why I did that is so that we can prevent any form of gaping if you eventually are going to be using a yoke for your corset. So this is what it looks like, guys. This is the back view of my corset. Aren't you loving what it looks like? If you can't wait to see the sewing tutorial, let me know. So this is all of my patterns. I've added my sewing allowances to it. I added 1/2 inch sewing allowance all around it. I added all of my annotations. I added all of my grain lines, and yeah, this is what it looks like. Thank you guys so much. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, leave a comment in the comment section. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in my next one. Stay blessed. Bye.